raising the flag. Canadian flags on federal buildings have been at half-mast for 159 days. They were first lowered on May 30th following the discovery of 215 unmarked graves at the site of a former residential institution in Kamloops, BC. But today, the government announced they will be raised next week ahead of Remembrance Day. Flags will be lowered in honor of Remembrance Day, then raised again, and going forward they will be lowered every September 30th, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. But this is not what the Assembly of First Nations wants. National Chief Rosanna Archibald called for the orange Every Child Matters flag to be raised alongside the Canadian flag. Will the government consider that? Let's find out. And joining us now is Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Mark Miller. Minister, welcome to Power Play, and thanks for taking the time to talk to us, because I know today was a busy day for you, but I'm wondering why decide to raise the flags to full mast and do what you're going to do now, today. How did you get to this decision?
Well, certainly it wasn't an easy one. The flags, as all Canadians know, all Indigenous peoples in Canada know, have been down for the longest period that they have ever been in our history, and with cause, given the findings that we have seen in Kamloops, Cowessess, and other sites of former residential institutions. The process by which they were taken down was quite rapid, and then a process began recently as to the timing and process as to how they be lifted. And given that November 11th is coming up, Remembrance Day, and indeed earlier than that, November 8th, which is Indigenous Veterans Day, to commemorate specifically Indigenous peoples who served and gave up their lives for this country. This was a moment to get perspectives from different Indigenous organizations, different groups of survivors as to the process as to raising the flags and properly honoring those people and our veterans, but also the process moving forward and properly recognizing that there is work to do in supporting communities and the discoveries that are certainly to be made in the near future. Is
this what Indigenous communities were asking for? You know, how were your conversations with those Indigenous leaders? Because you told us you were negotiating with them. How did the, conversations go? How was the tone? And is this what they were asking for?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it a negotiation. What we've heard loud and clear from all involved is that this is a responsibility of the federal government, and not to put it on the, on the backs of Indigenous peoples who are already going through a lot these days. But there were a different and varying ranges of perspectives, some ranging from leave the flags down until everything is found and in the light of day and children returned home to their communities, and others saying that it was time now to lift them. But what we heard resoundingly in that, no one expected a consensus, was that this was a responsibility of the federal government to take a decision, and this was the time to do it. Last night, we received a motion from the Assembly of First Nations, obviously one of the most important Indigenous advocacy groups in Canada, as to their position on the flags, and it reflected a number of steps that we were more than glad to oblige. And as of sunset on the 8th, on the 7th, so Sunday, the flags will go up to be lowered on November 8th, and then up again until November 11th, after which they will be lowered to honor our veterans, and then up again.
So, but today you mentioned
I don't want to interrupt you, but I'd hasten to add that that the survivors flag that we inaugurated on September 30th on Parliament Hill will be flown on the parliamentary precinct as appropriate.
But today the Assembly of First Nations came out and said they wanted to see the orange Every Child Matters flags flying on federal buildings along with the Canadian flag. That's what they were saying today. You didn't agree to this request. Why?
Well, it isn't so much, Joyce, as to whether we agreed with it or not. We were made aware of it late last night, and we're in a position to take a decision as to the request that AFN had made, as well as other groups, and it was up to us to take that decision. We are willing to entertain a whole range of options, but what we heard loud and clear is this is our responsibility. We need to take the decision, and if and when, and it certainly is a question of when other discoveries will be made, we'll follow the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. and follow those communities' leads in what they prefer to see in terms of honoring the lost children when those discoveries are made. So I think Canadians have to be braced for the fact that there will be further discoveries, and there will be a need to symbolically recognize that, as well as continue the work on the discoveries and getting to the truth of all this.
We understand that because yesterday our colleague, Krisa Nechikete, spoke to Cowess's First Nation chief, Cadmus Delorme, who did tell him that the Canadian flag should be lowered for many years until all the residential school sites are searched. I know that's a very difficult decision. What do you have to say to Chief Delorme?
Well, I think that's a view that is shared by many Indigenous leaders and survivors, and it perhaps isn't appropriate to make parallels to other catastrophic events in our country and periods of mourning, but the Canadian flag is rife with symbolism. It is a matter of immense pride to me and indeed the vast majority of the country. There needs to be a way to commemorate those events that involves the lowering of the flag. And this is a time where we have, in fact, lowered the flags for the longest time in our history to symbolize that very important moment. But I think what we've also heard loud and clear is there needs to be action, and that action is embodied in the investments that we've made in terms of supporting communities in looking and searching for the truth and accompanying them along that difficult path. And if there's one message I think to Canadians and Indigenous peoples living in Canada tonight, is that the Government of Canada will be with you side by side as you go through these difficult discoveries that are sure to see the light of day in the next few months.
Well, speaking of those difficult discoveries, Minister, so yesterday CTV News reported that the Star Blanket First Nation in Saskatchewan are going to start the process on Monday in a few days of looking to find the unmarked graves at the LeBret Residential School in their community, and they're one of many First Nations looking for those graves on their land right now. So we are sadly and unfortunately going to have these discoveries. We understand this. What do you do when these unmarked graves are found, when other unmarked graves are found? What do you do then with the flag?
Well, that's a very, very important question. And, frankly, I wish I had a much better answer for you. But part of the reason that I don't is this is a process that needs to be community driven. As soon as those discoveries are made and the community chooses to make that public, the importance for the federal government, who, and it's important to remember, is partly responsible for this state of affairs, is to engage with the community and give it all the support it can to properly symbolize and commemorate the pain that they're going through, and not take their place, but support those communities. So it'll be a case-by-case decision, Joyce. But it'll always respect the importance of what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission tells us, which is to give that space to those communities and to let them make their decisions and to respect their choices.
I don't have a lot of time left, but I'm wondering, Minister, do you have any regrets about how this is playing? About a debate now about a flag. Should it go up? Should it fly at half-mast? When should we put it back up? When should we put it back down? You open a conversation and we don't know where it's going. Do you have any regrets today that this is the way this conversation is going?
Well, if there's any regret that I do have, Joyce, is how we came to this state of affairs as a country. The inner workings of my mind are less important than realizing what happened in our past, and let's stop denying it. Let's look at exactly what happened, and I think that's what Indigenous communities have been asking us to do. They've had to shoulder the grief of many Canadians that aren't Indigenous over this last little while they are themselves opening up new scars and getting re-traumatized. So this is an immensely painful period. I think during the election, we certainly heard that this was not a topic of conversation, and people were lamenting the fact that this was so easily forgotten. But if there's one thing to remember is that we can't forget, and I think that's a particularly poignant message during Remembrance Week.
Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Mark Miller, thanks so much for taking the time. I know this is a difficult issue and a difficult issue to talk about, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Joyce.